So I grew up in Norfolk. I'm now 82. I graduated finally. I was a 6-year man graduating from Old Dominion and went on out to graduate school, University of Washington, Fisheries College. Maryland offered me a job, worked on the reservoirs. Maryland's got, I think, 9 reservoirs of size. Came here in the spring of 65, fall of 65. Since I was designated the reservoir biologist, the spring of 65, they had a massive fish kill up at Conowingo. Of course, Conowingo's got a big reservoir behind it. So they said, okay, you're the reservoir guy, go up there and fix it. Yeah, right. I was able to find out the cause and the nature of that kill, and by great good fortune, I found a way to avoid it. It used to be the shad and herring were vastly more numerous than they are now. And they would swim all the way up the bay as far as they could go, which was Conowingo Dam. And some would spawn in that area, and some would still be attempting to get further up. Well, Conowingo was built and closed in 28, and at the time they had operated 7 big turbines, 5,000 cubic feet per second each. And the market for electricity was such they decided to enlarge. So they added 4 more big turbines. They were putting out a lot more water at peak demand times, which dawn, early morning, and supper time. And that meant they were drawing their reservoir down a lot faster. And you could properly say that water's money to them. So because they had to draw that down so much faster, they had to cut off their flow at times when the price of electricity wasn't very high. They button their noses on the dam would turn off the water. There was such a number of fish they would suffocate because of no more oxygen. So that was the cause. Well, they've got more and different problems now. They pretty much managed to avoid the suffocation fish kills because now they have assented to releasing a certain amount of water around the clock. Pennsylvania has discovered that there are a lot of benefits to fish coming up the river that didn't used to know about. For instance, the American eels carry as a parasite the larvae of certain clams in their gills. And without those larvae being carried and somewhere upriver being dispersed, the populations of clams in the rivers collapses. So they need to get the eels up the river. Well, the eels, they climb over almost anything, but not Conowingo. So the dam entered into an agreement to capture and truck and travel those eels and take them up there above York Haven and let them go so they could start repopulating the clams. And then, of course, since about 2005 or 2006, we've had snakeheads. The state went and tried to kill all the snakeheads before they got loose, but it failed. And last year, 2020 or 2019, I forget which, they discovered that the big expensive fish passage facility they'd built on the east end of the catwalk was also passing snakeheads. So, damned if you do and damned if you don't. We used to have oysters all the way up the bay to around the Sassafras River. But as the Susquehanna Valley and Susquehanna watershed was cleared after the European expansion had begun, a tremendous sediment from clearing the land came on down, and those oyster bars that were in what we call the head of the bay, from about Tallchester up to the flats, got sedimented out. The depth up there, 6 or 7 feet shoaler than it used to be. And in fact, that sediment in killing the oyster bars in that part of the bay forced, as oysters have declined due to several other reasons, the state had to do what it could to reestablish oystering where they wanted to. And what they did, they hired Langenfeld up on the north end of Kent Island to go up there and dredge out the old shell from the beds that had been killed out by the sediment, take the shell and redistribute it down the bay, some of it in Choptank River and tributaries, where, while the oysters had been badly depleted, in certain conditions you still get a good spat set, and the spat like to set on the oyster shells. So they'd bring oyster shells from head of the bay down to all of these one-time wonderful oyster bars in the lower Choptank, the lower Treadhaven, Harris Creek, Broad Creek, and further, Little Choptank. And eventually, they pretty much mined them out. So you may be aware that in the last year or so, there's been a big controversy about whether they should mine shells from what's called man-of-war shoal, because the previous supply is pretty much gone. Now, I saw something interesting up there the other day. I had stopped to talk with Wayne Gilchrist, and he lives right there on Turner's Creek Road, and at this water end of Turner's Creek Road, there's an old wharf. The watermen work over there for whatever they're interested in. And they're doing some refurbishing of that Turner's Creek wharf. Got some heavy equipment in there and digging out. And I don't know what they're going to do to make it better, but something. And if you look in these cuts where they've dug out through the concrete cap around the old wharf building, you can see that landing is built on oyster shells. And you can see that by far and away the majority of them are shells no longer than that, which probably means that the shell that had existed up there when they were live oysters never got very big because it's very fresh water comparatively. And it probably also means that the watermen harvested them were harvested as big as they could get. Nowadays, they wouldn't even be legal. But anyway, you can look down in these cuts and you can see the strata of the oyster shells. Occasionally you'll get one that's 3 inches long, but not many. So you can see the history of that part of the bay and in the oyster resource right there where they're digging. And you go up there, well, that's Kent County, you'll cover that. You can look at that for the spy. There were 10 problem areas that were identified, and they finally decided they would fund efforts to correct 3 of them. By 1978, they had brought out a pretty good big compendium of what they had found about these 3 principal problems. By 1983, they held a big seminar over in, I think, George Mason University. and they had engaged Jacques Cousteau to come over and speak and kind of get everybody pumped up. And they did. He did. And that was essentially when the major amounts of money started flowing in for the bay restoration. At that point, all of the restoration activities were pretty much voluntary. And they sooner or later figured out, I think by 1987 or so, that wasn't going to cut it. And since then, you've seen a great deal more mandatory. And the funding, federal funding to execute the mandatory restorative measures. And here we are today, until 2010, when things weren't going all that great. And so EPA said, basically, we got to take a more active lead, and they did. And now we're 4 years from the target date, the date by which all the things necessary or thought to be necessary would have been done, and supposedly the bay will be back on its feet. Of course, people are already looking to see it may not happen. ESLC has made some statements about that. Shore Rivers, that I was working with good it. Nearly all of the nonprofits are essentially saying we're going to have a real hard time meeting those goals, and most particularly because of the government structure of Pennsylvania. Pretty much everybody believes that the major cause of the eutrophication is agriculture, the major remaining cause. Maryland has put a lot of money towards the improvement of the major sewage treatment plants, but that's comparatively easy because they are arms of government and you can twist those arms a little bit. The agricultural community is much more difficult. There is at least a move to reallocate some funds from what we call the flush tax towards agricultural uses. And I think it's a good idea. You got to. Evidently, you can't expect the farmers to do what good land husbandry would call for them to do in their own self-interest for that reason alone. You got to subsidize them to make them do it. Did you ever read Sand County Almanac?
No, I did not.
Aldo Leopold.
Oh, yeah.
His last chapter, The Land Ethic, when he was working at that sort of subject back in 1937, 38, it was thought, he says, that if you just gave the money to the farmers to do the things that the land should have done to it, they would do it. But they didn't. They only applied the practices that were short-term economic positive for them. And I think that's very much the case today. There always are some good land husbanders. I knew a farmer over there where we live said, you know, a good farmer will leave the land in better shape than it was when he got it. And there are some. And there are some that will put into practice these good practices if you subsidize them. And there are going to be some that you'd have to beat over the head. You're no doubt familiar with the Kent County government. The fellow that, I think he's been president of the commission. Ronnie Fithian, you know Ronnie?
Right.
Ronnie was one of the watermen that we hired back in the early 80s to take us out so we could make some measurements on the stripers when they were having a hard time with stripers. And he was as good a guy to work with as you could possibly want. Yet, since he was town manager of Rock Hall and subsequently in the county council, he's embraced this jackass idea that the problems of the Chester River, and by extension others, are the fault of Conowingo. And that lawyer that they hired, Chip McLeod, I'll stop there. I started out as a fisheries guy. I realized that the way we try to manage the environment is somebody proposes a project like a highway or something, and what we try to do is give everybody whose interest, whose job, whose duty is involved in that a shot at it to say what they think it means to them. We call this process environmental review. And the last 25 years I worked, that was my job, was doing environmental review. And that was very broadening because you had to deal with every kind of discipline that's involved in altering the environment. Learned to deal with the highway guys, the Aggie guys, the housing development guys, the dredging guys. And I feel like if you do that job satisfactorily, well, most of the time you're telling somebody what they ought not to do. And it was both very broadening and you felt like you were doing something worth doing. Well, I give the effort a lot of credit. It's made some improvements. Some of them are transitory. For instance, some years you have real good SAV, some years you don't. I don't think it's nearly as good as it ought to be. I don't know that I think it's going to get much better. I think it's going to be a continuing expense, continuing effort for decades. We have to do it if we expect to enjoy this area at all.